Welcome back to Leading Collaboratively. Today's most vital, flourishing new worshiping community leaders are exercising a different kind of leadership and power. We already saw earlier what happened when we flipped the script in Ormwood Park. The people expected the church to dictate terms. The man who stood up in that meeting was angry. Somewhere along the way, those who had experienced church before found it to be a place of hierarchy, and he wanted to know what we had decided they would do. They knew the church to be a place where relatively few had a seat at the table and made decisions that mattered. And they expected church leaders to behave with hierarchical practices and centralized decision-making. That was the case in the age of institutions. But in an age of access, what people respond well to is participatory leadership and decision-making. They are over hard boundaries regarding who does what and who should be involved with what conversations and what's off limits to whom. In an age of access, permeable boundaries, conversation, co-creation really work, which is great for those of us who are Reformed Christians, believing strongly in the priesthood of all believers. This is great for those of us who love that New Testament metaphor of the body of Christ, where we are exhorted to work together so as to avoid temptations that come from thinking we've got this by ourselves, we can do this all, that come from thinking that we can live into our calling independent of others, and particularly independent of less visible parts of Christ's body. A repeated characteristic of vital and flourishing new worshiping communities is collaborative leadership, specifically aimed for early on. So we're encouraging you to distribute responsibility for the new worshiping community. We are encouraging you to share the limelight early on, providing others meaningful opportunities to contribute. Great leadership scholar Warren Bennis once wrote, "There are two ways of being creative. One can sing and dance, or one can create an environment in which all singers and dancers can flourish." This is what we want. Thriving, vital, flourishing, new worshiping communities create environments where everyone can flourish. They distribute responsibility and create an environment where people feel empowered, where they feel appreciated. That's an environment where creativity flourishes. Engaged leaders who feel respected and empowered, they themselves are enthusiastic, they drive enthusiasm, they are more engaged, they get it done. But first, there's an important aspect to this you and your team leadership. And so now we turn to Janelle Holmes and Marthame Sanders to tell us about it.
Leadership development for a new church, at least in our context, for me has been something that I have really had to learn. It's like you're building the airplane as you're flying it. And I have learned so much. The leadership at the beginning, I had to really coach them in building relationships with each other. And so at the beginning, helping them to learn to say what they needed to say in a comfortable, safe setting, to trust each other, to say the craziest things they wanted to say, the most creative things they wanted to say, no judgment. And so at the beginning, that judgment-free creative space was so important to get them to talk to each other, to get their juices flowing for creativity, to get them to build those relationships with each other. As we started ministries that were more sustainable, we really had to, all of us, grow into those ministries and share them. And so a lot of the leadership development as we've grown as a church, the leaders have had to grow themselves into leading these specific things that they're passionate about. And so there's some people who are really passionate about mission. And so they have taken that and built a team, and they plan the things we do with mission and outreach. There are people who are passionate about worship and doing art and worship. And so they're on a team that meets quarterly to kind of map out, what are we doing in worship? What are we not doing in worship? What are we doing well? What could be improved? There is a team for everything that kind of happens, because as the organizing pastor, I cannot do it all. I'm not called to do it all. If I did it all, it would look just like me. That would be boring. And new churches are not about being boring. And so part of that internal work I've done is learning to trust people. Learning that they're going to do it. They're going to do it a specific way, and it might not be the way I was going to do it. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. That doesn't mean it's not as effective. And so handing those things off has been almost a spiritual practice of mine, handing these things off. At our last leadership team meeting, we're revamping our job description for the leadership team, and I handed that off. So a few people in the leadership team are going to evaluate it. They're going to talk about what they're actually doing in their leadership role, and they're going to rework that and bring it to the leadership team to present. And one of my interns said, I can't believe you handed that off. But it's been 3 years of practicing handing things off. And some things do not get done. If they get done, they don't get done well. And you know what? That's okay. That really is okay. As an organization, a church is run by almost all volunteers, and anybody who works with volunteers develops kind of a strong stomach for balls getting dropped. That's just part of the job. That is part of living in a community of people who are showing up because they want to be there, not because someone's making them, not because they're getting paid. I mean, they're coming because they're hungry for something. In Ormwood Park, they're hungry for relationships. It's a neighborhood that is connected to each other physically because they all have front porches. A lot of them have children, and so they are really interested in developing those relationships. They want to know each other. They want to be in each other's lives. They see a lot of each other walking around and running, and so for this neighborhood, being in relationship is very important. For this neighborhood also, it is a middle to upper class white neighborhood for the most part, but it is that because it is a gentrified neighborhood. So there are a lot of people who have moved here who are wrestling with what that means. What does it mean that I moved to Southeast Atlanta and I thought maybe I was going to be in a more diverse neighborhood, or maybe I was going to be helping a neighborhood kind of get back on its feet. Turns out I am the gentrifier. Turns out I didn't do my homework well before I moved here. Turns out the schools that I am going to send my children to are not high-performing schools. And they want to wrestle with these questions. They want someone to ask the hard questions, to hold them accountable, and to help them be better educated and to make better decisions. And so that actually is something that our congregation has helped with.
One of the key pieces for us, whether it comes to leadership and the development of that team or to the guests that we talk to, is representation. I'm a straight white guy with massive amounts of privilege in almost every room I walk into. I could do a podcast where I talk to other straight white guys, which in some ways is kind of the definition of podcasting these days. That doesn't accomplish anything for me in terms of trying to elevate voices that have traditionally been marginalized, especially within the church. And so having a strong representation of Black folks, of women, of gender nonconforming, of LGBTQIA folk, trying to give a broader sense of what it means to be created in the image of God as God's children, and to then turn around and to create art that is co-created with God. And so representation has been a key part of that. It's one of the elements I think that leads towards equity and justice, not only within the church, but also in the broader society. I think collaborative leadership is crucial, and the hardest thing about it is getting to the point where you can actually trust each other enough to tell each other the truth, even when it's hard. I think for me, in this odd format of a podcast, it means that I'm going to be sharing answers from guests that I might not echo myself. But this isn't about me gatekeeping their stories. It's about me curating their stories and curating stories by way of conversation. I'm a partner in that conversation. And so if someone says something that makes me uneasy, I'm going to say as much, and then we're going to talk about it. And then to trust them enough to be honest with me. And then before we ever make that conversation public, to trust them enough to say, I trust you with this, or I don't trust you with that. If I can't be trusted, then I shouldn't be doing this podcast. Trying to create trust virtually is challenging, often because we treat those virtual spaces like they're real world spaces. And so we are missing so much of that human interaction when we are in those virtual spaces. And so it just takes longer. It takes time. It takes the intimate building of relationships. Platforms like Zoom have these breakout rooms, using those for one-on-one conversations, for small group conversations, focused, intentional listening. There are great models like the clearance committees of Parker Palmer and the Quakers. There are models like Fearless Dialogues with Greg Ellison and Jojo Legister here in Atlanta. Ways and frameworks of creating patterns of listening and responding, of resonance, rather than advice giving or answer giving. Deep listening that allows for the building of trust, and taking the time to do that in virtual spaces and in real life is what leads to that deeper sense of trust down the road, which is so crucial to collaborative leadership.